part of the prosecution team is doing the conclusion of the closing arguments. What I anticipate after that is that we will break. I'll give you an opportunity to go to lunch. I will bring you back and I will charge you at that time with the jury instructions.
Okay. Give me just one moment to get set up here. Thank you. On October 5th of 2022, in the dark of the night, while the rest of her family slept, Leilani Simon did something incredibly evil. She murdered her own 1-year-old baby and then put his body in a dumpster, where just a few hours later, his body would be destroyed by heavy machinery. And we have proven that beyond a reasonable doubt. During the course of a murder trial, we spend a lot of time talking about the defendant and what the defendant did, because it is our burden to prove beyond a reasonable doubt what the defendant did. But because of that, we don't spend a lot of time talking about the victim, Quinton Simon, in this case. One of the elements that we have to prove in murder is that the defendant murdered a human being. And Quinton Simon was a human being. A real live little boy. He liked to play. He was funny. He was affectionate. He was a good eater. He loved cheese. He liked to camp out on the floor at the McCarta's house and watch cartoons. He was a real live boy, a human being, and he shouldn't be thought of as an abstract in this case. He should be thought of as a person. He should be thought of as the little boy who loved Danny. And you heard from Paul and from Toledo and say, Danny, Danny, Danny. He should be thought of as a real live human being, a person. A real live human being, a person, whose mother put his body in a dumpster. And we have proven that beyond a reasonable doubt. Mr. Dean told you that we don't have to prove motive, and we don't. It surprises people sometimes. Motive is not an element of the crime that prosecutors have to prove, but it's just not. But in this case, we know what the motive is, and it's important to understand that motive, to understand why a mother could do something so awful as kill her own child. Because it is. It's something so evil that it's almost unspeakable, incomprehensible that a mother could kill her own 1-year-old baby. So we have to think about the state of mind that this woman was in at that time. She was deeply, deeply unhappy with her life. She had 3 really small children. She had a 3-year-old, a 20-month-old, and an infant. In the best of circumstances, if you had family support, if you had your own place to live, if you had plenty of money, even in great circumstances, having to take care of a 3-year-old, a 20-month-old, and an infant would be so hard and so stressful. But to add on to that stress, she didn't have those other things. Her relationship with her mother was not good. Her mother was gone a lot, so that was not a real support for her. Her relationship with Danny was falling apart. Danny was getting fed up with her. Their relationship was falling apart. They didn't have any money. She was drug addicted. She and Danny were living in her mother's house in one room with these 3 children. And when we talk about her relationship with Craig, or the fact that she had 3 children with 3 different fathers, we're not trying to call her a slut. Nobody is trying to slut shame the defendant. We wouldn't do that. This is 2024. That's not what this is about. When we talk about those things, what we're trying to show you is that this woman's self-esteem came from men. And part of why she was so deeply unhappy was because Danny was rejecting her. And it made her feel horrible because that's where her self-esteem came from. And that's why at 22 years old, she already had 3 children with 3 different fathers. Because men were so important to how she saw herself and how she felt about herself. And that's what was part of why she felt so awful that night. You saw the suicide video that she did, where she talked about how unhappy she was. She even said to her children, I can't love you because I can't love myself. It doesn't seem she ever intended to kill herself. It was something she was going to send to Danny probably for attention, for him to feel sorry for her, because she was manipulative of Danny, very manipulative of Danny. And the reason that she started this sexual relationship with Craig was to fill a void there. And this sexual relationship with Craig was a new thing. It's something that had just happened in the weeks before this. So, on the night that she killed Quinton, Danny had rejected her. She's using drugs. She's on cocaine, marijuana, Percocet, and maybe alcohol because we saw her go and buy beer at the convenience store. She's under the influence. She said in her own statements that drug use made her angry and impulsive. So she's unhappy. She's mad at Danny. She's under the influence of drugs that make her angry and impulsive. And so she goes to Arkwright looking for Craig because Craig is where she has been getting that need fulfilled for male attention that makes her feel better about herself. And Craig's not there that night. That's why it matters and why we made Craig come in here and testify, because he wasn't there that night. And so she couldn't get that need fulfilled. She couldn't feel better about herself. So instead, she does something so drastic. She killed Quinton. And in the act of killing Quinton, she became a sympathetic person and got Danny's attention back. She became the mother of a missing child. And Danny ran out of work to be by her side. That's what she wanted. That was the manipulation. And it's so hard to believe a mother would do that. But that's why you have to think about her frame of mind and how low and desperate she felt that night, and that she was under the influence of drugs that she admits make her angry and impulsive. That's what happened. You also may wonder, why Quinton? Why that child? And Quinton was her disposable child. She did not like Quinton's father. She loved Zane. Zane was her ride or die. You heard Michelle McCarta talk about how she would say Zane had been through everything with her. He was her ride or die. And Sky, who was her youngest child, the baby infant, was Danny's child. She needed Sky to keep Danny around. Quinton was disposable. She didn't really like Quinton. We heard testimony about how she would call Quinton names. We heard testimony about her hitting him, about her pushing him in the pool. She didn't do this to any of her other children. She would feed Zane before she fed Quinton. She didn't do that to any of her other children. Quinton was disposable. And so she disposed of him in the trash can. But that's why Quinton, and not one of her other children. Her plan did not last. Her story came apart really, really fast. Because the police, when a child is missing, It is all hands on deck, and they're going to start using every resource they can to find this child and see what's going on in this household. And it was within a very short period of time that they discovered her vehicle on those flock cameras leaving home during the night when she said she had been at home. So it was within hours that they knew she was lying. The defense also said that we don't like to talk about Danny, and that's not true. Like, we talked about Danny a lot. There's nothing about Danny that makes us uncomfortable talking about him or why he didn't do this. There's overwhelming evidence that that one is the person who killed Quinton Simon and not Danny. The defense also kept talking about Danny being up at 3 o'clock in the morning and seeing Quinton. That did not come into evidence in this trial. Go back and check your notes. That is not something that is in evidence. The only mistake Danny made was in the morning when he left at 5:20 in the morning. He originally said he saw Quinton. And he talked about that. He just assumed it because he woke up in the dark, got ready for work, quietly left the house. He just assumed Quinton was there then. He did not go over to the pack and play and look in and say, hey, Quinton, you there? He didn't do that. And so because he had not seen anything weird when he left home, he just assumed that Quinton was there and it was fine. And when pressed and questioning, he explained that he had not actually gone over to the pack and play and looked and made sure that Quinton was there. That is the only inconsistency in his statement, and it is very understandable. The defense has started trying to suggest that Danny could have done this, but Danny's not the one that was at the dumpster in the middle of the night throwing a bag of trash in, a dumpster that later went to an area of the landfill where Quinton's body was found. It was not Danny's phone that was at the dump. It was not Danny's car driving to the dump. It was her. She drove to the dump. And she admitted that she was there. Mr. Dean spent a lot of time making it clear about where this trash went to the landfill. The landfill is huge. And Quinton's body was found in the specific part of the landfill where the dumpster she was throwing his body into put its trash. Otherwise, he never would have been found, which is what she wanted. She didn't want him to be found because then forevermore she could be the mother of a missing child and sympathetic. I want to talk to you about the burden of proof. Mr. Hilliard said the state hates the burden of proof, and we don't. We welcome that burden. It is our burden, and we welcome it with open arms because we want the right person convicted. We should have to prove to you beyond a reasonable doubt that she's the person that committed this crime. And we have, and she is. We don't hate reasonable doubt at all. Mr. Dean talked about reasonable doubt. I'm happy to talk about reasonable doubt and burden of proof. Reasonable doubt does not mean, as the defense suggested, that we have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt every fact that we put up before you. What we have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt is the elements of the crimes, and we have done that. It means a doubt with a reason. Not just any doubt, but a doubt using your common sense. So you go back in that jury room when we're done, and using your common sense, you ask yourselves, did that woman murder Quinton Simon? And the answer to that is absolutely yes, she did. Absolutely. And all of the evidence points to her. All of it. Mr. Hilliard also spent a lot of time talking about emotion in this case. And yes, this is an emotional case. Murder cases, by definition, have emotion in them because a human being has died. And the murder of a really small child, there's no way you can escape emotion. There's going to be emotion. People who testify are going to have emotion. We're going to have emotion when we talk about it. It's unavoidable. But asking you to find her guilty based on emotion. We're asking you to find her guilty based on all of the facts and evidence that we have put before you. The 34 witnesses that have come in and testified and told very specifically how these events happened. All of the statements that you've heard the defendant make, where she changed her story over and over and over and over. That's what we're asking you to make this finding on of her guilt, the actual evidence. And when it comes to her emotion, that's fair game. You absolutely can consider her emotion and her demeanor when you're evaluating this case. And it's important to look at her emotion because while it is absolutely true people react differently to trauma, none of her reactions were anywhere within what is believable. They just were not. There's some people when something terrible happens to them, they shut down, they're very quiet, they're stoic, they give one-word answers. That's totally normal. There are other people who become absolutely hysterical, they can't even talk. Absolutely normal. There's a wide range of human emotions. What is not normal is for a mother to wake up and find her child missing and react the way this woman did. She didn't run upstairs to Paul, who was at home, and say, Paul, Quinton's missing. Have you seen Quinton? Is Quinton up here? She didn't do that. She didn't go wake up Paul. Paul had no idea what was going on until the police were there, which was 20, 30 minutes later. She didn't go running out in the yard, in the woods, looking for her child. She didn't do that. She called Danny. Because that's the whole motive. She wanted Danny's attention. That's why she did this. And so Danny's the first person she called. And she didn't do another thing until Danny got home. Danny got home and found her just standing around outside. She wasn't looking for Quinton. There is no mother who would not look for their child frantically under these circumstances. She had not called the police. She'd not asked Paul for help. She'd not called over to the McCartas and said, hey, Quinton's missing. Do y'all have him? She didn't do any of those things. She waited for Danny to come home because that was the whole point, was to get Danny's attention. And it wasn't until Danny was at home and he had reached out to the McCartas, Michelle suggested they call the police, that things started happening. That is not normal. Her lying through the course of this investigation is not normal. It's not normal. Because she wasn't a worried mother. She was a murderer trying to hide what she did. We cannot prove to you the way she killed Quinton. We can't. Because she made sure that his body was decimated, was ground to nothing but bits of bone. And under the law, defendants are not rewarded for that. The law does not require us to prove how she killed him when she's the one that hid how she killed him. You're not going to hear anything in the judge's charges that say we have to prove how she killed him. The defense can say it all they want, but that is not an element of the crime that we have to prove. And please listen to the law, because you will hear that. We don't have to prove that. It is not the fault of the state that we can't prove that. It is her fault, because she made sure that his body would be in such a state that we couldn't prove it. She wanted his body never to be found. And if it weren't for the work of a whole bunch of people who really cared about getting justice for this child, enough so that they would put all this gear on and dig through stinky trash trying to find him, he never would have been found. That's also part of how we know that this is not an accident. Her behavior and her statements. If something had happened to Quinton and she had found him injured, not responsive in his pack and play or something like that, she would have called for help. She would have woken up Paul. If Danny was still there, she would have asked Danny for help. She would have called an ambulance. That would be normal. There is zero evidence in this case that this child had some accidental drug overdose. There's just not. He did not have access to any drugs. Everybody has said he couldn't get out of his pack and play, so once he was in there, he was in there for the night. He wasn't roaming around, climbing on shelves, trying to touch stuff. And they didn't just leave drugs lying around because they were expensive. And pretty much they used them right after they bought them. Also, we tested his brain matter. There was no indication of any drugs in his brain. This is just not an accident. We went above and beyond to rule out every other possibility for this child to death. Medical, accident, SIDS, it's none of those things. It's that his mother murdered him. One other thing I want to say about Danny is Danny leaving. Danny did leave town. He didn't just leave. Like, law enforcement knew he was leaving, and they were still in touch with him. He didn't just run away. Danny had no tie to Savannah except for her. And when this happened, there was tremendous media attention, and Danny wanted to get away. It's totally understandable, does not suggest any kind of guilt in any way whatsoever. His phone was still tapped at that point. Law enforcement was still in contact with him. There is just nothing to suggest that Danny had anything to do with this. And you saw Danny on the stand. Danny broke down talking about Quinton. And it was very genuine. And you could tell that he had emotion for this child and was sad about what had happened to this child. It was a very realistic, normal emotional response that he had. A child's mother should be the one person in the world that they can count on to keep them safe. Parents have a visceral, emotional need to keep their children safe. It is normal, it is biological, but that is not what Leilani Simon did. She murdered her child. She put his body in a dumpster where he would be taken to a landfill, and his little precious body would be ripped to bits by heavy machinery to cover up what she did. Leilani Simon is not a mother. She is a monster. And I do not use that word lightly. But what this woman did in this case is horrific, and she is absolutely a monster. We cannot undo the horror of what she did that night. We can't undo it. It's done. We can't undo it. This child is gone, and nothing we do or say can bring him back. We cannot give him back the 80 or so years that he should have had ahead of him, a long life, all the things he should have gotten to experience. We can't give him back to the people that care about him. We can't do that. But what we can do for baby Quinton now is give him justice. He deserves justice. You can give him the justice he deserves. And you can give her the justice she deserves.
So, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, at this point, that will be the last you will hear the attorney speak directly to you. So at this point, before I release you for lunch, I'm going to remind you to follow the court's instructions. Do not discuss the case with anyone, not even with each other yet, because the case is not with you yet. Don't allow anyone to ask you any questions about the case. Don't do any research on the case or the folks involved. Avoid all media, including social media. So at this point, I am going to release you. We're going to return in an hour. The time now is 1:07, so I'm going to round it up to 2:15. When you come back, be ready to sit, and I will give you the instructions at that time. I will warn you, it takes at least a good 30, 35, 40 minutes. That is what you're going to hear from me. All right? And so with that, thank you for your attention. You are released for lunch.
Jurors are exiting.
Everyone, please have a seat. Thank you.